Why, hello! I trust that this audio finds you either gripping with the end of the year or exuberant with its passing. Either way, thank you for letting bandwidth coast to coast invade your auditory cortex. We are, fundamentally, the same beings as we were in ancient times. I was actually just talking with a friend of mine about the most recent Pompeii discoveries, and the conversation quickly landed at how we are essentially the same beings as then, only our technology and some of our culture has changed. I would extend that with technology comes an influence into our culture, which then influences back the prominence or course of that technology, so on and so forth. From either sacking of cities, or the increased comfort or size of the luxury elite, or in the way in which I would posit technology has been most influential, that being an increase and disbursement of widespread luxury goods into the mainstream. The problem, insofar as I see it, is that we haven't transcended our base human traps, at least not collectively, at least not for a sustained enough period of time to influence the course of our species and have us land at a new plateau, thus escaping the seemingly inevitable traps. I really like how my guest puts it. He said when we find ourselves at another nexus point of success is when we are most likely to become victims of it. Or more directly how he puts it, confidence in success is the harbinger of failure. For certainty alone leaves you blind, to say nothing of another point made, when reaching a quote success, what and why you were fighting are lost. And the struggle to get there gives you such relief when it's over, that resting on those laurels is so tantalizing a thought, it becomes the aim. Or to steal from episode 8 again, in response to my thought that humans are comfort-obsessed beings, generational great historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto responds with something I think about daily. Comfort is the enemy of well-being. With that comfort we find ourselves in, it sparks many a movement towards conservatism, towards maintaining the status quo. But again, to highlight a point my guest makes in this episode, an effort to be more conservative tends to lead to many radical things. And how frequently it's a rediscovery of the past and an effort to preserve it that leads to an upset of the status quo anyways. Hold on to that thought for future because it's going to be something I already planned on expanding upon before I even talked with my guest. If you couldn't deduce from the pod thus far, I thoroughly enjoy the art of conversation. How the way one thinks, what occurs in their thoughts, and how that plays back and forth with those that you're conversing with, and what ultimately comes out of it. This episode was a wildly fast and generative conversation that I've listened to several times over and over and found new nuggets of gold each time. So much of it that I struggled for weeks with what to say in this message. Instead, I'm going to frame it this way. Us as a species frequently find ourselves to be trapped by the comforts and successes we achieve in order to then have them collapse inwards onto ourselves and our societies, radically and chaotically transforming them. And that this trap, whether it's the Gallic people on the borders of the Roman Empire or the global world touched by American culture and blue jeans, it's as old as time. We can fight it in an act of conservatism, but it's likely to lead us again to very radical ends nonetheless. Where the likely best course of action and least likely to happen is to never stop trying to achieve the next success. To not rest upon your laurels, but recognize that everything is in a constant state of needing improvement and needing effort. Let me read you this quote from Wilhelm von Humboldt that my guest from episode 2, Rowan Price, recently sent to me. As soon as one stops searching for knowledge, or if one imagines that it need not be creatively sought in the depths of human spirit, but can be assembled extensively by collecting and classifying facts, everything is irrevocably and forever lost. Now that I've given this all a thorough framing, my guest for this episode is Philip Parker, historian and author of History of World Trade and Maps, The Empire Stops Here, as well as many other books. Real quick before the episode starts, if you'd like to find us on your social media platform of choice, sign up for our mailing list to be the first to know about episode drops, know about upcoming guests or opportunities to ask questions and provide suggestions, please visit us at bandwidthpodcast.com. And of course, if you like what you hear, please follow, comment, or subscribe to the pod, however it is that this is getting to your ears. Without further delay, my conversation with Philip Parker. Hope you enjoy. All right. So thank you very much for talking with me. Just so we have it, would you mind just introducing yourself, and then I'm going to kick us off.
I'm Philip Parker. I'm a historian. I specialize in the late antique and early medieval world, but I have a kind of a wider remit. I dabble in a lot of areas, and particularly maps and the history of cartography.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if many people outside my wife know this, but I'm a huge geek for maps. And when I told her that I was going to talk with you and one of your specialties was maps, she was like, "Oh my God, that's got to be so exciting for you." I was like, "Yes, it is." So a question that I ask everybody as when they're first guest is, "What do you do that makes you happy?" So I'm going to ask you that, and then we'll kick on off and talking about maps and all the like.
I guess something that I can guarantee will make me happy is browsing in one of my favorite bookshops. Actually, one of my very favorite bookshops is it's a travel bookshop just close to here called Dawn Books, which is filled with travel books, books about travel, books about the history of particular countries, and maps as well. So um, it's just there's an endless world of possibilities there. You can just pick almost any book off the shelf and be utterly engaged with it. So there and some of my other favorite bookshops, just half an hour there is guaranteed to restore my mood to an adequate level of happiness.
I like that. That's a great thought, and something I think I just realized now that I'm missing quite a bit with COVID is to being able to just sit and peruse.
So we were denied that completely for about 4 months until retail opened up here, and they've taken all kinds of precautions, and so now at the moment they're all open, so I can browse to my heart's content.
That's great to hear. So I there's a lot of topics that I would love to kind of touch upon with you, because you have like a very wide breadth of interests. So I want to kind of ask, this first one is, what got you into your one of your more recent, if not your most recent, books on world trade? And I was just curious what brought you into that kind of space, and yeah, what brought you there?
I'd actually already done with that publisher a history of Britain in maps. And so the idea of looking at history through kind of a series of episodes illustrated by maps was already there. And I think it was really actually I was kind of chatting with the publisher, and we were talking about the effect of COVID on the world economy, and in that conversation, I'm saying, well, it's not the first time. Look at the Black Death as the obvious example of an absolutely catastrophic pandemic situation, and how did that shape the world economy? How did that shape local economies? So from that, the germ of the idea grew pretty quickly into say, okay, what about world trade through maps?
What was most fascinating when you were going through that? What did you kind of take away as like the biggest, especially with now? Because like, I study a lot in the ancient world, and the thing to me that I find so interesting is how long it took ideas and goods to travel, and now like the routes are they're much faster.
Mm. I mean, I kind of almost look at it the other way around, which is to say that actually, it's something I was aware of, but, until you're focusing on a particular topic, in depth, and gathering together all of the information, it's really sobering to realize that a lot of trade routes are of absolutely immense antiquity. That we have, sometimes we might have the idea that, okay, in the kind of Neolithic or pre-Neolithic age, people were just kind of where they were, and stuff arrived. But you don't really focus on the way that actually, that flint that traveled 500 miles, somebody or a series of people had to, either all in one go or over time, trade it for something else. So, the lapis lazuli, which was kind of basically only obtainable from one mountain in Afghanistan, it still made its way to Egypt. Which is quite a distance. So there were people intrepid enough to fulfill that need. Even in that period of deep antiquity. So although it's true that now something gets from Tokyo to San Francisco. 10 hours later it's there, and that in itself is astonishing. But all the same, kind of in that deep past, even though it took 3 months for something to traverse the Silk Road from Chang'an in China to end up in Baghdad. all the same, it happened. That was a huge achievement, and it's almost mind blowing. The fact that we talk about the fact kind of knowledge of paper transmitted itself from China over the Silk Route. But when you look at it from the trading perspective, actually, that's it's a pretty astonishing thing that technology, 2,000 years ago, was still able to percolate that distance.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wonder, and I think about this sometimes, is how much, because of like what you said, something can go from Tokyo to San Francisco in 10 hours. I wonder how much of the novelty of that wears at whatever it is, right? Like if you see something in the ancient world and you have an idea of like, I have no concept of what actually where this came from. So almost like the novelty and the value you put into it, I wonder if it was greater than where it is now, where it's just kind of like, oh yeah, I just got something airlifted, from from San Francisco the other day.
Sure. A lot of societal and cultural developments are driven precisely by the search for novelty, and it becomes progressively more difficult as the world knits itself together. To find that novelty by the 15th century, end of the 15th century, with a kind of the European advent in the Americas, a world system is beginning to develop, but all the same, there are large patches of it which are not in constant contact or don't have the capacity to be in contact with one another. But now, you can, with a couple of clicks, you can see on Google Maps or on Google Earth anywhere in the world. It's the search for novelty has to go even further into kind of virtual domains. So yeah, I think if I was living in kind of 14th century Paris, the idea of an elephant would be a quite extraordinary thing, and actually seeing these exotic beasts, did begin to turn up in the menageries of kind of royal palaces. Actually seeing or talking to somebody who'd seen one would be an absolutely extraordinary thing. And I suppose it is. I suppose it is a thing that we've lost. That physical wonder at something. I recall the first time that I saw the pyramids in Egypt, and I was very excited, approaching Giza, going in the bus. I think there was a bend we go around, and there are the pyramids. And for a millisecond, my first thought was, that looks like the pyramids. Because, I'd seen images of them so many times that the reality simply matched precisely what I expected. So yeah, that we have lost a bit of that novelty and wonderment because we just can see and reach out to so many things.
Yeah. I think a lot of things is arcs of kind of humanity, or maybe even just tropes, is kind of always becoming a victim of our own success in a lot of ways. Maybe it's just kind of emerging quality of a lot of things, but I definitely think that's your point is well taken, that we have to kind of keep searching for more and more novelties. And to go back a little bit, like how you said how some of these trade routes are so ancient. I just finished a book. A previous guest I had was Felipe Fernandez Armesto, and I just finished his book Amerigo, and I love his snarky writing. I think it's really entertaining and
he's great.
Yeah, he's quite on the button with a lot. But there was a point that he made in it, and was just essentially the kind of meandering almost of these trade routes and kind of the finding these trade winds, and it was all just kind of by happenstance, and they never really knew where they were. And at least in Amerigo's case, he was kind of always lying about where he thought he knew he was versus where he really was. And what it got me thinking was, maybe it was a century before, or maybe even sooner than that, there was the Chinese emperor that went on like the grand parade, or what did he call it? It was like a grand gift giving, where he sailed all around the South China Sea and all the way through. I think he even got to the Suez Canal and whatnot, and just giving gifts. And then, I think it was the preceding emperor, or maybe towards the end of it, decided to shut off China. And what it got me thinking is, one, like, they could have continued to keep going, right? Like they obviously had the means to do that. They just culturally decided not to. But two, how much, to your point, how much these trade routes and ideas, like, almost all of the agriculture that took off in Europe came from the East to West, right? And Jared Diamond really does a great job in his book on that. And the interconnectivity of us as a species has been one of constant flux and constant, sharing and appropriating for as long as we have history, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, but to take the Chinese example first, which is it's very particular. It was the emperor sent out. He was this guy, Admiral called Zheng He, who went on 7 voyages and he got to almost to the Suez Canal and right away down the coast of East Africa as far as modern day Kenya and Tanzania. And it wasn't exactly trading, in the sense that we understood it. It was an exertion of power. I mean, as far as the Chinese emperor was concerned, frankly, there was nothing outside China that really could enlarge the wealth that he'd amassed. So it was really about showing how powerful China was, which is something that trading nations do to an extent today. So he sent this admiral on 7 voyages to kind of establish a tributary relationship. And the people that he visited gave gifts, which the Chinese took to be an acknowledgement of recognizing China as their overlord, which was not really the intention of the gift giver at all. The intention of the gift giver was that these people would go away if you gave them something nice. Amazing things went back, including a giraffe, which was, I think, the first one ever seen in China. And it was there's a mythical Chinese beast called, I think, a qilin, which looks it's something with a very long neck. It looks a bit like a giraffe and it's incredibly lucky. So when it arrived back in China, there was immense excitement that this mythical beast had finally been found under the reign of this particular emperor, and it was intended to be very auspicious. But Zheng he almost, he went so far in down the coast of East Africa that had he gone a little bit further, and technologically, there's no reason why he couldn't have. It would have been the Chinese and not the Portuguese who first rounded, the kind of Cape of Africa. And, the Chinese would have, I mean, there are some historians who allege that, they did, but, that would have got into the Atlantic, first. And, what impact would that have had? It's a kind of great what if. So there's a lot of kind of chance in this, like you said, Amerigo Vespucci, he sort of, he wandered around getting a little bit lost and sort of came across some things which turned out to be useful. The Vikings discovered Iceland and particularly Greenland, they discovered by getting lost. I mean, they're known as enormously effective navigators, but, from the saga evidence that we have, those who are alleged to have come across the coasts of Iceland and Greenland first got there because, or at least they said, they didn't know where they were going. So, these things, there's a lot of chance going on there. But, trade, it's a bit like water. It's heading somewhere anyway. There's a need, there's a kind of impetus. So we can't say, who's going to be the person, or even necessarily which part of a culture is going to be, who's going to transmit agriculture, who's going to get around the coast of Africa first. But, probably we can be pretty sure that somebody is going to do it. If there's a will on one side and there's a need on another side, eventually those two ends are going to match.
That sparked a thought that I don't know if I've ever had before, and that's almost as if us as a species. Okay, so I know like Jared Diamond and his Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it's a common question of why was it that Europeans were the ones that colonized kind of the whole world and all of that. That's essentially the onus of that book, and I know it's an ongoing question. But the thought that you kind of sparked in me now, which is, it's almost like us as a collective culture of species, we're working, from the agriculture means that went east to west, and, from China could have, if they culturally decided that they wanted to pursue conquest or any number of reasons of what they would have. But obviously they had a large empire with enough resources. They didn't really have the means to do that, where Europe had, Felipe didn't like when I used the word friction, but I'm going to use it again. They had the cultural friction between the different groups and kind of the legacy of almost the fall of Rome, which created a power vacuum that created all of these type of warring groups and sometimes even whole territories that are empty, that created migrations and whatnot that kind of sparked that. But it's almost like someone was going to get there, and it was because us collectively were moving towards that, not necessarily that there was one that was kind of at the tip of the spear.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I mean, far be it from me to disagree with Felipe on the use of the word friction, but I think, there's such a thing as being too successful as a civilization or a culture. Reaching a point of sort of equilibrium. Perhaps great cultural advancement, perhaps great wealth. That leaves you maladapted to face a new challenge. So, the Maya in Central America, for example, incredibly successful, and people argue endlessly about exactly why the Maya cities, experienced this enormous collapse around about the kind of beginning of the 10th century. But it's likely to be because they became so successful that their population grew beyond the bounds of the resources to support it. But they'd also developed a culture which depended upon, it being that large, and so it collapsed. The other way around, in Europe, the competition between societies, between nations as they emerged, which was quite violent, resulted in societies which needed to develop stratagems to fight more, to develop the ability to fund armies, which actually made Europeans, very adapted for kind of, violent confrontations with cultures outside. And, gunpowder, which was a Chinese invention, was not put initially to the same kind of amazingly effective use, as kind of, personal infantry weapons that the Europeans did, because, the Europeans were fighting amongst themselves an awful lot. So, there was this incentive, with the resources they had, which were not as, kind of large as the Chinese, to do as much as you can. So, something like, the Dutch or the British are kind of arch examples of this kind of, relatively small societies, which become, in the case of the Dutch, from the 16th, 17th century, just amazingly effective. And that's because, they found a way to leverage their quite kind of exiguous resources to an amazing extent. And that's something that happens so much in Europe because, things went very badly wrong in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. It took a long time, and all those iterations, all those struggles, produced in a way kind of societies which were very, very honed to collide with other societies. It kind of bred a kind of almost kind of predatory mentality, which some other societies did not.
Yeah, that's the predatory point. I think is one it's a good one because of the fact of it. So I've studied a lot of the ancient Rome, and I realized recently that both the Republic and Byzantium were two pieces that I kind of didn't hold enough attention to. So lately I've been diving a lot into the Byzantium, and I most recently just kind of I'm decompressing or unpacking or whatever adjective you want to use, kind of the structure of the state and the military and all that. And to me, it was quite fascinating how different it was. And I talked with another author, Steele Brand. He wrote this book, Killing for the Republic, and I'm nearly finished with that. I had to put pause on it I'm reading a book for another guest. But he dove into the makeup of the Roman Republican military and kind of the citizen soldiers that it creates. And that is such an amazing story of a victim of its own success, where it's like you have this familial citizen soldier arrangement that then goes on to conquer, most of the Mediterranean world, which could have been also because of the friction between the Punic Empire and Carthage and all that. And then that kind of transforms itself into like, well, now we have all of these other soldiers we can conscript from. Why do we have to be doing the fighting? And then that obviously leads to a collapse. And then you get to Byzantium, and they've kind of accepted that structure. And they've kind of worked around it to kind of use the best of it. And, there's commentary from emperors that, like this, I can't think of the region, but it was a mountainous region, is like, that's the best area to get soldiers from because they're hardy and they're tough, as opposed to the more, coastal areas that are more cosmopolitan. And it gets me to think of, you're a victim of your own success. And then you kind of transform into something else. But, almost that medieval or, late antiquity, buddy up and even into the Renaissance, Europe was never really given that opportunity to be able to kind of rest on its laurels, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, with the Roman Empire, one of the extraordinary things which you will have been discovering there is that some version of the system survived for more than 2,000 years. And when we give ourselves a pat on the back about how wonderfully successful our societies have been. And we think, well, the British Empire lasted, well, say, from, the early 18th century to kind of, the 1970s, the kind of longest extent was 200 years or so. That's an amazing achievement. It's a tenth the period in which the Roman Empire grew, evolved, and collapsed. So, the Roman Empire, in its various forms, from the Republic, to the Principate, to the kind of Middle Empire, Late Empire, and then kind of Byzantium, it did reinvent itself several times. It had the capacity to do that. Ultimately, its adaptations led it into a kind of political, diplomatic, military cul-de-sac from which it could not escape. That ultimately, it faced forces for which it needed more military resources than it could muster itself, and so it had to rely on people outside who kind of in the end were not to be relied upon. So it found itself in an impossible situation, but nonetheless defied the odds for several centuries. But Byzantium, kind of Roman Byzantium, it was one sort of society. In Europe, what we have is multiple. We have 10, we have 12. Kind of one of them fails, another one will rise. So kind of out of that cauldron, something is going to bubble up. One of the reasons that kind of Europe really prospered is this balkanization, that the states which emerged were it's a sort of historical Goldilocks zone in a way, that they were neither too big nor too small. If they'd been too big, they might have found a perfect adaptation to one situation, and then something would have developed and they'd have collapsed. If they were too small, they would not be big enough to thrive, and they would have been gobbled up by something else. But those kind of middle ranking powers that you get in Europe, like Spain, like France, like Britain, to an extent, even somewhere like Venice can count as a middle ranking power, I think, by this definition. There were enough of them that they could adopt varying different strategies. That one of them is going to prosper at any one time. If Sweden is down, and then Prussia is up. If France is down, then Britain is up, which actually perpetuates the conflict and the competition between them. And out of that, it's kind of it's a very human thing. We can see it on a personal level that it's the competition. It's the getting ahead that gets you to kind of refine your strategy, refine your tactics, learn new things. And it's the same with nations. With no competition at all, we end up like Easter Island. But kind of Europe, those nations competing against themselves. What you get, the Industrial Revolution, you get that kind of imperial kind of outburst in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's the competition breeding success, and then the type of competition and culture that kind of comes around it is all the emergent qualities and conundrums that kind of spark from there. So with your history of trade routes and maps and the like, would you say that the Venetians and kind of those middle Italian states played an outsized hand in shaping those routes, at least as the way that we see them now?
I think they played an invaluable role in kind of reconstructing a system which had more or less fallen apart, in the late Roman Empire, which is the kind of Mediterranean trading zone. Now, obviously, a lot of that had been, occupied by the kind of the growth of the Islamic Empire, kind of the Umayyad Abbasids, and then the kind of, when that broke apart into various kind of sub-states. And whilst, trade had still gone on, it was, I think, really, the Italian city-states who began, quite frankly, with piracy against North African Islamic states, but, moved on quickly into trading with them. And so I think that played a kind of, an invaluable role in kind of reigniting those trade routes and kind of, sparking those trade routes kind of further east into life. There was a kind of, the Venetians were kind of, they almost kind of monopolized things like the sugar trade into Europe, and obviously kind of even more valuable than that, the spice trade into Europe. Those kind of spices had been, absolutely kind of gobbled up by the Roman Empire. And, in the Middle Ages, the supply kind of tended to dry up. And the Venetians, the Genoese, kind of slightly early on, the Pisans, they began to trade very effectively with kind of Islamic powers further east. And that kind of, that really got things going again. But more than that, I think, although, various types of financial and kind of, quasi and pseudo banking institutions had sort of, had existed, the time of the Roman Empire. Kind of there are things which approximate to checks, kind of in Roman Egypt in the 1st century, kind of AD. But it was, I think, the early Italian city-states that really kind of began to bring that together and kind of, knit trading with banking, and so that the type of contract which spread risk across a number of merchants who kind of bought, portions of a ship, kind of knitting that back to people on dry land who were actually kind of going to fund that. So it wasn't just the merchants themselves who took that risk in the kind of very early versions of it. So those things kind of, coalesced together. So basically, it's kind of really about leveraging. The Venetians and the Genoese, particularly the Venetians, they were kind of able to leverage themselves financially. They were able to find a way effectively to spread the risk, to trade more than, a small city-state kind of, on the face of it, had any right to do. And that really, you get a virtuous circle there, because once everybody knows that the risk is lower, investing in a Venetian, financial trading project, trading cotton to Egypt, more people want to do it. So they got more resources and it grows. They have more trading outposts, down the Adriatic, kind of they have a whole trading quarter in Constantinople. It feeds in on itself. I mean, ultimately, of course, they will become, the victims of their own success. They will get involved in, fights on the Italian mainland, which were incredibly expensive and draining. Their success will come to the attention of, other predatory European powers who want their pounds of flesh from this. And so, gradually the competition grows, and, by the kind of 17th century, the Venetian star is waning. But for several centuries, they're really carrying the flag as far as kind of the acme of kind of financial trading sophistication.
That I like the acme. I was reading about from Felipe's book. I ended up doing a bunch on Lorenzo de' Medici, and I was really surprised by what I was learning as far as like the business and I don't think they call them corporate. Maybe they do call them corporations. It's too early. My memory is fading a bit, but just kind of the business arrangements that they do, and kind of. So I do like transformation in business and that kind of software development consulting. That's what I do in my day job, and reading the way that they were analyzing and kind of like combing over the best ways to like get, increase their investments, or like you said, spread risk, and kind of the white, like hedging their bets, even down to, when they've discovered the new world in the first, couple of years, people were like, is this even worth spending the money to go out there to do it? What are we going to get? And kind of reading those documents, I was really thrown by it. I guess I one of the things I love reading history for is just how much my misconceptions get, or my presuppositions get shattered, right? And then that kind of like leaves a whole new landscape to kind of try to sort it all out. I want to ask a question. So I'm really obsessed with culture. I would say that's probably like one of my biggest obsessions. And if you had a muse, what about the culture that kind of came out of this, almost barbarism or piratism in the North African coast? How did that culture emerge into one of this type of, almost cosmopolitan? I would say like very cosmopolitan in the sense of, they, just to kind of set the stage a little bit, like the Italian city-states in the early Renaissance and Renaissance area, they definitely had an air of sophistication that they like to present themselves as. And they definitely, had a business sense, as well as they were kind of trying to position themselves as the legacy of the Roman, Republic. And my question really is, how did this type of business economic, instead of saying like, we're going to take a very hardline military stance, we're going to try to hold land, as opposed to what they really did, which is we're going to try to increase business and trade and use that as our leverage?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of transition from the kind of medieval and late medieval world, to, kind of what, for want of a better term, everybody has ended up calling kind of, early modern, is absolutely fascinating. And, in a way, it's an example of what I call sort of accidental radicalism. So the kind of, in a way, the kind of search, wishing to be conservative kind of ends up with kind of actually quite radical development. So, kind of a cornerstone of medieval thought was that, basically nothing should really change. we need to hold on to, kind of, canon law. We need to hold on to, how things were done in the past. Basically, if things are going to change, as was the kind of medieval attitude, things are going to change for the worse. So, what we need to do is to keep things the same. In order to do that, we really need to understand how things were, to kind of keep them on that level. But that leads you into kind of, that leads you into changing things. So kind of interpretations of kind of biblical text can lead you kind of into different directions. Things, you were talking about kind of the corporation before. So, the idea of, the church as a body, the church kind of exists, separate from its members. So this leads you into the idea that that there could be a legal entity which isn't actually people. That's what in the Middle Ages was called, a corporation. So, the fraternity of, Saint X or Y, or a university comes not to be the people who are there at any one time, but there's something kind of overarching that, a corporation which has a separate legal existence. Indeed, it comes to have separate legal rights. A city can claim separate legal rights, as a kind of corporation. It's not just the people there, it sort of has a right to it. So this kind of, begins to feed into notions of, that, the people of a country may have rights, separate from the actual people who are living there. So, your attempt to be conservative there begins to lead you into quite radical kind of philosophical notions. And with the Renaissance, the idea that we want to preserve the past means we have to kind of look at the texts that we have. Now, actually, they didn't have very many kind of Roman kind of classical authors, very few Greek, a bit of kind of Aristotle, not very much Plato at all. But, they clung on to them. But what begins to happen is people, begin, not just monks in individual monasteries, but in 15th century Italy, people begin to look into the papal archives of monastery scholars to find out kind of stuff the Romans have. And this actually leads them on to a realization that, the Romans had some pretty kind of, radical kind of political ideals. They really discussed things, they debated. So these kind of, these ideas kind of begin to bubble up. The idea that actually rediscovering the past in an effort to preserve it can actually kind of lead you to kind of upset the status quo. And that's what begins to happen in Italy in the 15th and 16th century, that, the rediscovery of what really is trying to, kind of seal the past, leads them to understand that actually, kind of Greek and Roman doctors had some ideas, they had some techniques that we don't have, they dissected things, something that had been, almost stopped in the Middle Ages, sort of began again, kind of, I think, 1315, 1325, the first kind of one in Italy. But, to do those things, to actually look at the human body, to understand, how it's made up, rather than simply looking at the text, the realization that, well, actually the Greeks and Romans, particularly the Greeks, they did that. So that's what I mean by kind of, an effort to be conservative can actually lead you in quite radical directions. And I think the kind of Renaissance is an example of that.
I'm going to be thinking about that for quite some time. That thought of in an act to be or an attempt to be conservative, you end up becoming more radical. That's very true, and across a lot of time I can think of. That's very fascinating. So I have a question. This is a follow-up, and you might completely tear down my question, and that's totally fine. How much do you muse that the Renaissance was influenced by trade with the Arab world versus the rediscovery of some of these texts and monasteries, or at all, or is it mostly just like you said, the monasteries and the kind of combing through of texts that were kind of lost, or at least not as widespread, or as kind of the ideas transformed throughout into the society?
It's got to be both things. Both things are true. So something like something as simple as Arabic numerals, which undoubtedly came from North Africa, came from Italian trading into North Africa. So and as a merchant discovering that, if you've ever tried to do long division using kind of Roman numerals, you will realize what an immense boon kind of proper Arabic numerals were. A lot of stuff comes through Islamic Spain. So the kind of the Reconquista, the kind of Christian reconquest of the Arab states. From basically the 11th century onwards, once they kind of take Seville and Cordoba particularly, there are a lot of manuscripts there. And a process of translation. It's already been translated from Greek into Arabic, and then it gets translated from Arabic back into Latin. And so a lot of stuff comes in that direction. Some stuff comes from North Africa, particularly medical texts, which come from North Africa to Salerno, where the first kind of known European medical school is established. And then a whole bunch of Greek documents turn up at an opportune time in the mid-15th century when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks. So a lot of, the kind of refugees, the kind of Greek-speaking refugees from there, they got kind of effectively manuscripts in their baggage. Partly, I guess, because it's actual kind of cultural currency. If you turning up as a kind of refugee in kind of, in Venice or Genoa, if you've got, a bunch of Greek manuscripts, actually that kind of, it increases your value, increases your ability to reestablish yourself. And so, they turn up there. Add to that, there have always been sitting in the papal archive, sitting in kind of, monasteries like Bobbio in kind of, in southern Italy since, probably been sat there since the 6th century, that they've sat in a monastic library. They haven't been at the forefront. Nobody's destroyed them, but they haven't copied them because they didn't answer the particular kind of needs or requirements at the time. So, these things all come together. But it's, I think, only, it's in really the mid-15th century that people really start in Italy deliberately looking for these things. I mean, there had been an immense thirst for them in Spain earlier on. There's been this big process of translation. And earlier in the Islamic world, in the kind of 9th century, a kind of, a whole kind of house, kind of like a proto-translation center was set up. Kind of Beit al-Hikmah, I think it was called, that was set up to translate documents from things like Aramaic or Syriac or Greek into Arabic, because, if there was a kind of knowledge renaissance happening, it was kind of, in a way, happening in the kind of Islamic world in the 9th century at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. There was a kind of immense thirst to know what these kind of particularly Greek manuscripts were saying. So, they were preserved there, and, they survived, and then they got transmitted. So, things were coming from kind of all kinds of different directions.
That's delightful to hear. I challenged I had an interview in the first episode of the series, actually, where a friend of mine said that the monasteries were the ones that really kind of hold the most weight in the Renaissance, and I was like, I don't know. I think the Arab world plays in a pretty outsized hand.
I think, I'm sure somebody has done an audit, and, if they haven't, it's about time, that they did. I count up basically of, the great classical manuscripts, and, where exactly, do we have them from? What's the proportion? I suspect if somebody did a tot up, it would be, that it would be like, something like, up to a third is coming through Spain that way, kind of round about a third coming from kind of, the Latin tradition and monasteries, and, at least a third coming through retransmission from the Arabic world, and through Egypt as well, particularly where, a lot of stuff had survived just because of climatic reasons, that the papyrus, it just does survive. So, a lot that was not necessarily translated at the time was able to be recovered later.
Yeah, that's a great point. Something that I've been thinking a lot about since going further into Byzantium is how, up until the Ottoman conquest, how much of the modern state of Turkey and that area was speaking Greek. And that's something to me that I'm kind of thinking a lot about, especially in our modern contemporary times, where we think that the borders between nation states is kind of set, and we kind of accept that, when the reality is that they're never really set, and it's always this kind of cultural and economic and military line that's constantly shifting, that we take for granted the stability of it right now. When for myself, I've never actually really spent time in Istanbul. I had a layover there for a little while, so I didn't really get to see much, but I just kind of always perceived that area as more of the East, than it was the West, when really that's actually a more contemporary, because I'm training myself to think more in thousands of years and millennia, as opposed to thinking of in hundreds of years, because really the arc of human history is probably better set that way.
I mean, the territorial, kind of extent of modern Turkey is, it's an object lesson in how cultures transform and develop over time. I mean, if you wanted to pick any one country and say, look, where can I get the kind of the largest span of time of things that I can actually safely, more or less, now go and see, then Turkey would be it. You've got heaps of kind of Greek remains kind of throughout the span of Greek history. Way back to kind of the mound of Troy. In the southeast, you've got kind of a lot of early Christian stuff and kind of Syriac monasteries and so on. You've got kind of Roman remains. You've got kind of everything through the kind of Islamic era into the kind of early, the Seljuk Turks and the kind of Ottoman Turks. And in the east, you've got stuff going way further back, kind of right into the Bronze Age.
And Göbekli Tepe as well. Göbekli Tepe is, which we don't know how old.
Yeah, I kind of forgotten that briefly. Basically the first temple. It's a kind of I haven't yet had the chance to see it. I'm kind of dying to go there. It kind of defies the historical kind of narrative in that it's this immense, sophisticated stone structure that predates as far as I'm going to predates agriculture. It was sort of like the kind of historical propaganda goes. We get agriculture and then people start to build these things. But that was there before. How did they build it? What were they thinking? What kind of kind of Mesolithic society sustained such an enormous effort? So Turkey has kind of everything kind of encapsulated. So it's a great lesson in how things just change over the great arc of time. You can't say that kind of one society is such and it's going to be like that for all time. That's a kind of it begins to be a kind of the idea of a kind of monoethnic kind of nation is the kind of more or less a 19th century one. The idea that the kind of the borders are fixed and forever is something that in a desperate attempt to kind of avert warfare is the kind of it's a 20th century kind of aspiration, which turned out not to be entirely sustainable. But you look further back and you see, okay, change is just always going to be the case sooner or later.
Yeah, and so many of the peoples. I mean, the UK is a great example of the intercultural mixing and like other people coming in and then dispersing or then leaving again. It's just everywhere is kind of always this kind of cocktail, if you will. And Turkey is also, I mean, it's a great case study for a lot of things. Professor James Gelvin, he was on recently talking about Israel-Palestine, and he made a really great point. And he's like, if you really want to have a case study in what a modern nation state is, just look at the founding of the modern state of Turkey. And what they did to kind of create this nationalistic, idea of what is Turkey and kind of, going out through. The thing about just to go back to Göbekli Tepe really quick, the thing that really fascinates me, and if you ever get a chance to go there, please let me know, because I would be dying to hear your experience of it, is how the oldest, well, they don't know how old it is because they're intentionally not excavating all of it. And they're being very intentional with it. But that some of the oldest structures are actually the best built and best preserved, which is so shattering, like you said, of the narratives of how long have we been building these monolithic structures? How long have we been living in societies that could organize themselves to do this? It's so fascinating.
It's the sort of capacity to organize, which is so astonishing, because sometimes we make fallacious assumptions about the past that people did not have kind of mental faculties or the ability to do things that we can now. Clearly, in the 11th millennium BC, they didn't have the internet, but they were capable of kind of organizing themselves on a scale which if you took 100 people at random now and told them, okay, I'd like you to build this immense megalithic structure, they would not be able to. So in some ways we've become dependent on a lot. In some ways, kind of as individuals, you might even say that we've regressed in our ability to kind of to organize these feats. But the assumption that they could not is entirely fallacious. I mean, clearly, you look at something that's been known for an awfully long time, Stonehenge, in the southern UK. Now, the organizational ability, needed to put that together. I mean, we still don't know exactly how, they got the stones. I mean, it's been established pretty recently, without a shadow of a doubt, which part of South Wales, they came from. But exactly how they got them there, it's still something that people, archaeologists and archaeotechnologists are are really puzzling about. That they had the ability to perform these astonishing feats, and they talked about it, they planned it, they puzzled. They got it wrong perhaps the first time, and then they developed a better way to do it. But this kind of human urge, to get together, probably in a competitive way, to kind of work out a solution to a problem. It was always there.
Yeah, and aligning it with the stars too, right? Like I'm so fascinated by the fact. Well, I muse a lot about the ancient world, and one of the things that I said in an essay recently was, I think that there's a lot of lessons we can take from our collective past to help us understand and going through in the future. Because, in the time that we're presently having this conversation, all the wonderful things that, brought us the microchips and airwaves and radio that make it, we're on pretty much other sides of the marble right now, able to talk, are also bringing with massive amounts of change to the ecosystem and all of that. And we really have to try to figure out a way going forward. And I think one of the ways to do that is actually by looking backwards, and kind of understanding our place in this rock. And I think one of the things that the ancient world did that maybe we see as a unnecessary novelty is looking at the stars, and they obviously did it because from agriculture and needing to actually understand when to plant, right? So we need to know when the summer solstice is and all of those things because it had, actual value. But in doing that, I think it kind of reminds us of our smallness in the world, and perhaps in getting collective acts together to build things that are giant, like Stonehenge or Göbekli Tepe, or any of these ancient structures, or even ones in the Americas, is a reminder of we can do something that's great and grand, but also reminding of us of how incredibly small we are in the grand scape of, let's not forget that we're pretty much on a giant spaceship, right?
I mean, one of our great kind of human abilities is to transmit knowledge over time. I mean, obviously, animals, they they transmit kind of knowledge kind of in an immediate way, to their young. But one of our abilities is to do that over time. But and even more than that, we have the intellectual ability to ignore things, I'd say. Which is to say, kind of most animals, they see danger, they act upon it. So one of our kind of one of our human strengths and failings is our ability to see something and not act upon it, and also our ability to agree that something which is not the case is true, in order to allow us to circumvent a problem. We can agree that saber-toothed tiger is not there, because it enables us to take another action which will enable us to dispose of the saber-toothed tiger, right? So this has enabled us to create great things, but it's also left us with this failing that, everybody, pretty much everybody really knows that if we carry on consuming resources the way that we are doing, in the way that we are doing, absent some other development, things are going to go very badly wrong. So we have the capacity to know that and to ignore it, or we have the capacity to assume that because we solved a problem in the past, we're somehow going to solve a problem in the future, which is in some circumstances, kind of stood as a society is kind of, in great stead. But what we need to do is to go back to the there is this enormous and present danger, and we need to do something about it. We need this is what we need not to ignore, because ignoring things gets us places sometimes, because we're not kind of rooted to the spot. adopting exactly the same strategies as we always have done in the past, which may not work. We need to acknowledge this.
That's a really good point. And another thing I'm going to ponder is our ability to ignore things and the benefits that that brings. You know, like there's numerous examples in history of facing a problem either with, you know, a cultural friction, as I'll call it, where you're going up against another civilization or state or something like that, and choosing to ignore some, you know, part of it or piece of it, you know, kind of like your analogy with water again, allows you to flow in some other manner and find another avenue. But it's also kind of a victim. We can become a victim of that own feature set itself. You know, it's not a bug; it's a feature. It can become a bug if, you know, left to its own devices.
I mean, it's always enabled, and the most successful societies to to be more kind of flexible and adaptive, which is to say, most animals, you know, they've found a way to solve a particular problem, and, you know, they'll keep on doing it. Maybe they got kind of, you know, two ways to solve it, but humanity has the ability. Okay, there are 11 different ways to solve this problem. One of them appears to be the best one, but we know it failed. One of them appears to be really stupid, but let's try it anyway. And, you know, that may just be the thing that kind of allows you to leap beyond everything else. I mean, you know, on the face of it, you know, if I describe the banking system as, okay, let's all pretend that I have a lot of money I don't have, and you agree with it, and then I'm going to give you this money I don't have, and you're going to pay me more of it back. Now, kind of on the face of it, that sounds absurd. But actually, if everybody agrees with that, as long as nobody says at a certain point, hang on, I want all this non-existent money back, then it works for everybody. So what on the face of it seems to be a kind of, you know, kind of a maladaptive solution to a problem. You know, the obvious solution is just kind of stick with what you've got. It was enough. But actually kind of, you know, because we have this kind of higher order ability to kind of pretend non-existent things, like kind of, you know, the belief in kind of, you know, supernatural forces, which, you know, okay, who knows, they may exist or not, but we can't be sure. So we're kind of, we're pretending or having faith, depending on your kind of, you know, your view on it, that they exist. But, you know, it creates a whole different kind of set of, you know, solutions to a problem by, you know, taking that point of view, which only humans are able to do.
Right. And our imagination is an incredible. So Felipe, again, he actually challenged me when I said that, you know, is imagination like a truly human thing? And he made a good point of like, no, that, you know, predatory species probably have to have an imaginative faculty in order to be able to kind of run through some of the things they have to do, like tracking and stuff like that. They have to kind of conceptualize in order to, you know, go in and get a kill. But I definitely think, if you want to comment on that, go ahead.
The kind of, you know, the predators, you know, they have the algorithm, you know, which has been kind of honed by nature, and it kind of really works. But, you know, what it doesn't do is decide to be something else completely different. You know, it's like, you know, I've written an algorithm, you know, I don't know, kind of to solve some current financial conundrum, and that's what it's going to do. You know, it's not going to tell, you know, it's not going to tell me, you know, what I should buy for my groceries. So, you know, the kind of, you know, the animal, it can be, you know, incredibly efficient in that way. But, you know, okay, there are no longer any zebras, you know, there are no longer, you know, anything that looks like a zebra. So, you know, the lion is not going to say, okay, what I'm going to do is start to kind of eat berries. You know, it's going to starve, most likely. So that, you know, that's the difference with humans. You know, we don't necessarily have to, you know, we don't have the single algorithm. We don't have, you know, which we can hone. You know, the lion can get better at what it does, you know, because evolution will push it in that way. You know, the ones who have the slightly better algorithm are going to breed more lions. But, you know, we can, you know, we have the ability to say, you know, hey, you know, I don't like this. I'm going to plant maize instead. You know, I'm kind of, you know, this kind of hunting wildebeest is no good. There aren't any anymore. I'm not going to sit down and starve. I'm going to do something else. And, you know, and that's the difference. You know, that's the imagination. Imagination is not, you know, exactly, you know, conceiving of kind of future within certain bounds. It's thinking of something, you know, almost completely different. It's thinking, you know, what if I do something else? What's going to happen? You know, what actually if, you know, instead of being at the mercy of kind of it raining or not, what if I can pray to somebody and he'll stop it raining? I can do that. This is not something that, a lion or a zebra is going to be able to do.
Yeah, definitely. The bounds and ways we're able to make it modular, right? Which is in really almost any of our faculties is the adaptability and malleable nature of anything from and going back to your point of a lion can teach its young how to hunt, but the lion that grows up isn't gonna all of a sudden go stumble upon something that's 6 generations back that's going to be a useful piece of information, right? Yeah. And then be able to conceive how they use that in their time, right?
Yeah, and now one of the great challenges we have is that we've sort of we've compounded that even more, possibly to the point at which we can no longer cope with it. Throughout most of human history, a manageable quantity of knowledge was available to be passed on and to be built upon, steadily, sometimes in great leaps, but certainly it's kind of said, in 1650, you could know pretty much everything there was to know. In a lifetime, you could learn kind of all that was useful. And now, that's inconceivable in a sense. Kind of more data is more knowledge is being created every second than I could possibly process in a lifetime. And there's a question of whether we've reached the point at which we can't actually process or build upon that kind of amount of knowledge and data usefully. I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, the answer is probably that we build a secondary level construct which helps us to organize that so that we can then build upon it. Probably that's the adaptation, because this is what humans do. We're not terribly good at anything, but we're very good at making the best of what we have, and we're terribly good at finding an unlikely set of kind of historical and technological ingredients and doing something with it. So I have some faith that we will.
Yeah, I do too. I worry about the pace of all of that. That's something I personally worry about, is the pace of the change and the pace of the information overload and the pace of kind of needing to have these constructs. Because this is something, especially in being someone who works in tech and has dabbled a lot in AI, the pace of information and the amount of data and the amount of, like you said, things to sort through is so astronomically large. And it's only getting bigger and more complicated every day, that I wonder how much the tools that we're going to make, which I do think about this. And I do think that let me bracket for a second. Like there's more information created almost every hour than there has been, in all of history beforehand, which is awesome. But that just means that there's more to sort through, and being able to find value in this or that, it becomes incredibly harder. Also being able to trust whatever it is that you are. So value and trust, right, is going to be harder. And to your point, you can have an Isaac Newton or an Alexander von Humboldt, and they could be multiple discipline individuals who are just astoundingly creative and generative in multiple fields, because of the fact that they kind of were at this sweet spot or Goldilocks, a nexus of information. And I wonder what it's going to do to us going forward, because the paradox of our time is that it's never been easier to have such a greater access to information, but it's never been harder to find what it is that's valuable.
But, we do have the benefit today that, in the past, how many kind of Newtons or Humboldts were there, kind of around, with sufficient education and access? Not an enormous number, perhaps there were 20 or 50 or 100 potential Newtons, of which one emerged. Now we have, tens, hundreds of millions of, kind of people who may potentially make that breakthrough discovery. So yeah, there's a kind of, there seems to be an infinite quantity of information, but there's an awful lot more people with access to it who may produce something. I mean, the problem is the pace, I think. That in the past, we learned by making an awful lot of mistakes, and something that seemed to be a mistake turned out to work very well. Now, very often the stakes are kind of higher in a shorter time frame, that we don't necessarily have the luxury of making a decade or a century's worth of mistakes in order to kind of evolve an answer to the problem, which is what was in the past, that they have a year or a month or kind of half an hour, the worst possible case. So that's the kind of the stakes are much higher on a shorter period of time. I think that's the worry, that because as a species, we're not necessarily given to making kind of enormous leaps in that shorter period of time. We kind of like to kind of reflect a bit.
Yeah, definitely. I hope the listeners aren't upset how many times I've brought this up, but in Rousseau's first discourse, I'm going to summarize one of the main points in it, and it's technology almost always outpaces our morality to deal with it. And that is something that when I was first introduced to that, is something I've never stopped thinking about, because, I mean, you can think of what a chemistry set could have done, 20 years ago versus what somebody can do with just going and looking up a video on YouTube, and to your point, just like not just an individual's act of what they could do to kind of tinker or whatever, but, at the scale of countries and corporations and kind of what they're able to do to kind of have the laboratory of what can go right and what can go wrong. It's always going to start with, well, I don't know, but let's try. And the kind of the pace to be able to put the lid back on it and stamp it out versus, learning something from it is getting all the more, thinner of a margin.
Yeah. And I think throughout time, it's a reasonable assumption that any piece of technology or any invention will be used. I mean, one has to operate on that basis. Whoever discovered it on the whole, is not able to keep it a secret, even if they, kind of acknowledge that, it's kind of problematic. So, the first thing you have to do when you invent something is know how to counter it. You already have you need to have a system to stop something being used if you need to stop it being used, and that, this is the case with military technology in particular. It required kind of an immense, diplomatic effort and will over decades to stop kind of a nuclear war between the kind of, between the Soviet bloc and the kind of Western allies, and several times, at least the Cuban Missile Crisis, and once, kind of as worryingly, kind of in 1992, 93, it came within, hours, if not kind of minutes, of a kind of nuclear holocaust. But both, I mean, in that case, both sides really, really, really understood what the consequences would be, and frankly, the cost of backing down was managed. Well, I mean, in one case, it never occurred, but in the case of the Cuban Missile, the cost of backing down was managed enough that both sides didn't kind of lose too much face. But we can't be sure that that will exist in the future. When it comes to particularly perhaps biological weapons, perhaps kind of weapon systems which are based kind of in the atmosphere. We can't be sure that we will have the kind of the leadership and the time to stop that happening. So we need to stick fail safes in there. To begin with, the first thing on discovering something like this must be actually just because we can use this. Maybe we should just kind of put it back in Pandora's box if we can.
Yeah, and I think a lot about genetics and the kind of genetic revolution that's, I'm going to say silently, because I don't think it's mainstream enough for people to realize just what is happening there. To the point of the example that I always use, because it's kind of banal and sedated enough to not really scare anybody, but that's you can get an injection that changes your eye color. Like that's something that's going to be very possible, and it's actually not that far away. And something to your point of the stakes of the Cuban Missile Crisis and numerous other examples where there was actually orders that were given to launch missiles, but it turned out to be weather or birds or something like that it was mistaken, and the individuals just didn't pull the trigger. Right? There's numerous examples of that. At least a handful that I can think of. But the thought that I think of, back to my obsession with culture, is the individuals who kind of raised with that, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like that. Kennedy was in World War II. Like he saw what the horrors were, and he understood like the magnitude of what we're talking about here is so much greater than what he saw, which, World War I was actually just talking about this with my wife last night. the numbers that were coming back from the death tolls, and some of these battles, especially in France and like the middle part of it, is just so astounding. At the time, they just couldn't believe it, right? And then it happens again, in different capacity in World War II. I worry how much of our another ongoing theme I bring up a lot is comfort. How much the individuals and leadership we have now are not even just learning the lessons of what you're saying of like going forward. We really need to make sure that we understand that when we discover something new, it's going to be a Pandora's box of conundrums that we're not going to see. No things are all good or all bad. It's always just what it is, and then what emerges out of it. At least myself and my own personal, thoughts and musings. I wonder. I genuinely am worried about if our leadership is able to even learn the lessons of the past and the technologies we currently have, particularly with nuclear weapons, let alone these ones that are coming up with, either genes or really any number of technologies that come from the AI is another great example of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing though that is striking is that the level of deaths from military violence in the latter part of the 20th century and first part of the 21st century is actually much lower than it has been possibly almost ever as a proportion of the kind of world population. That kind of leaders in kind of at least democracies are kind of allergic to military casualties, and a good thing too. So we don't tend to get engaged in wars if we can possibly avoid it. And the level of casualties which are regarded as unacceptable 3 generations ago would have been regarded as almost trivial. If you were talking about fighting a war in which the casualties were in the thousands, people would have told you, well, kind of that's how many people die of dysentery even before we kind of fire a shot. This is an amazing achievement. So that's in a way that's a positive thing. However, the development of non-conventional kind of warfare, kind of biological warfare, genetically modified kind of viruses, kind of catastrophic computer viruses, which will kind of destroy the infrastructure of a country with potentially absolutely catastrophic consequences. Those things which sometimes may be being developed in an effort to avoid conventional military casualties, may result in an absolutely catastrophic situation if it kind of completely shuts down the health service of a country. I mean, imagine a combined, kind of like computer bomb with a genetically modified virus which hits a country at the same time. The casualty figures could be absolutely, catastrophic, and that could have been developed by a country which didn't want to invade. It didn't want to suffer military casualties, didn't want to fight a conventional war. So, it's going back to, like trying to be conservative. It ends up with being very radical in a way. Okay, my problem is I want to preserve my manpower, not suffer casualties. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this innovative thing, and that's going to result in something, far more cataclysmic than actually I was seeking to avoid.
Yeah, no, I was actually thinking as you were starting to say that, the kind of a victim of our own success again, right? Like we don't want to fight these conventional wars. Something again that I always try to remind myself, just the kind of the immense gratefulness I have for being born now, is almost every war, the majority of casualties weren't on the front lines. They were from secondary effects from starvation, because no one really dies of starvation. They die of dysentery or something else that gets them. Or they got wounded slightly on the battlefield. It wasn't a stab directly through the heart or something like that, but it was enough for them to get an infection. Like that was the majority of people that were dying. It wasn't necessarily from battles. There are obviously battles like the Battle of Cannae, where it's just like 70,000 people just die in one instant, which is, well, not an instant. It was really brutal. Where today we don't have that anymore, right? And like to your point, 3,000 troops that were lost is almost table stakes in almost any other conflict, where now it's like, no, 5 we're going to hear about, 10 we're going to hear about, depending on the theater. And it's almost breeding these other unconventional, like the one that I think a lot about is misinformation, because that is like, there is a Cold War happening right now, and it's happening in an information war, which goes back to our point of how do you sort through it all, and kind of the mechanisms of doing that.
I mean, it's again, with particularly that kind of information war and the kind of, the fact that kind of, tension between kind of, what was the Western Bloc and what was the kind of, former Soviet Bloc, it's still there. It's ongoing, and why wouldn't it be? Because this competition absolutely would never have gone away. It was a naive assumption to presume that we could just stick our feet up and kind of enjoy the peace dividend and everything would be lovely. But it's part of this capacity to persuade ourselves that something which is patently not the case, that if kind of Russia's the saber-toothed tiger here, it did not turn into a kind of beautiful kind of tortoiseshell cat or indeed kind of go away. It's still there. It's still a competitor. In the brutal round of human history, you stop competing. You presume that you've reached the end point. You presume kind of in that way you've reached the end of history. The end of history is the end of you, kind of as a nation. That's it. The end of your history it may be, but not the end of history, kind of globally. So yeah, I mean, these struggles kind of still go on, and they're still ongoing. And in this case, if we ignore them, it will not be to our benefit.
No, and it rarely is, I suppose. At least in the macro sense. That's interesting. It definitely ties back into the thought of it's a feature to be able to ignore something, to be able to then go capitalize or take advantage of another area. But ultimately, that pendulum will swing right back around, and if you're not ready for it, it might just hit us right in the chest. That's interesting. I want to ask you a question about maps. So, being an individual who's studied a lot of it. I want to ask you, so a concept that I use a lot is the map is not the territory, right? So a map in general, any map is really just a model of whatever region or geospace that you're looking at. And the culture or even just the individual, right? You can go to Vespucci or anything, any other numerous examples of the individual has motives, or maybe the culture in which the person is drawing this map has motives, and that's going to come through into the map itself and kind of frame what the reference is. So my question that I want to kind of start this next line of thought of is, what have you seen as far as in your studying of maps and global trade, and kind of going from a papyrus to bits in this evolution of maps and cultures? And is it something that shapes both two-way? So like the culture shapes the map, and then the map goes back and shapes the culture?
Yeah, I mean, it is a two-way thing. And to sort of go back even further and to tie in with some of the things we've been talking about, that, part of, the kind of the human ability to kind of conceive of something different is the fact that, another thing that, we do and have always done is construct narratives and construct stories. I mean, we see the world as a story. We see the story of what I did yesterday and the story of what I'm going to do today. And, that story never really matches the reality of what went on, for the practical reason that we can't do it second by second. And for the secondary reason that, we remember things which are important to us, or indeed we remember and relate things that we believe are important to other people, to put ourselves in the best possible light. Now, maps are in a way kind of a part of that. Maps are, a visual story of the way in which we kind of relate to the world. Now, on a very simple level, it's, the map is the story that we need to get around. On a more complex level, the map may tell a different sort of story. The map may tell a story of, the power of our particular nation. We color it in a kind of delightful shade of red or green to show, this is British, or, in kind of modern kind of graphic technology, we may kind of build a cartogram, which, has, the size of countries according to their kind of wealth or their population. And that's a story to, you put them side by side and you see, okay, those two things don't necessarily match, which, visually with a map tells a particular story. So, so we kind of shape maps to tell a story that kind of either we want to tell or we want to tell to somebody else. So maps of, you look at a map of the Balkans, say, I saw a kind of delightful ones which, kind of explained the kind of the impossible kind of situation which led to the kind of Yugoslav wars and tensions in the Balkans at the moment. It was a map which showed greater X, so it showed kind of greater Albania imposed upon greater Bulgaria imposed upon greater Romania, and these things overlapped. So visually, you could see at once that without some compromise, or indeed without some kind of modification of the kind of the historical and national narrative of the respective countries, there was never going to be a solution which was acceptable to all the countries in the region without them coming to blows or an external power coming in and kind of and intervening. So those maps produced in kind of Hungary or Romania, which showed the kind of the maximal extent of the historic claims of those countries, were part of a narrative of either kind of sometimes assertion, sometimes a narrative of even historical victimhood to say kind of look what we have lost, look what has been taken away from us. In the case of a map of the Greater German Reich in 1939, 1940, it was an act of kind of assertion, kind of an act of kind of almost kind of visual aggression of that narrative saying this is Grosses Deutschland now, this is it. So those maps can be they can be used for very political purposes and kind of shaping kind of exerting a culture, kind of dominating other cultures, as well as that as well as that kind of pure storytelling. You look at kind of some of the very, very first maps, kind of famous Babylonian world maps, kind of 600 BC, which has has Babylon in the center. Of course, kind of any good map has whoever we are, Babylon, China, kind of Rwanda, Venezuela, Britain in the middle. It has some kind of towns which are satellites of Babylon. Those are the important things, and then on the edge it literally has kind of mythical beasts, because hey, we don't know what's there, we don't care what's there really, but it's bound to be something pretty unpleasant.
That's interesting. I think a lot about, well, I have a lot of frustrations with the American education system, which I won't even go into because I think just saying that is enough. But one of them is the Mercator projection, and kind of the, I don't know if it's unintentional or intentional. Perhaps at some point it was intentional. I'm not going to get conspiratorial or anything like that. But kind of the mental model that it posits into people of the size of things, like the size of South America, the size of America, the size of Europe, the size of Asia and Australia. All of these are misconceptions that were helpful for transatlantic crossings and understanding the currents and all of that. But what it is unintentionally kind of posited into us as a culture, speaking at least from Americans' standpoint, is the relative sizing of geospaces. Which we then, like to your point of, overlaying a cartographic projection of GDP or population, or wealth or trade, or really any number of dimensions. Like you can see like there's, Europe will blow up, or America will blow up, or, whatever it is. Oil is one it's commonly used, is like oil production and kind of use, or carbon is another one. So then we overlay this Mercator projection to it, and it gives us this kind of false sense of footing, if you will, of really what kind of the sheer immense in space of things. I know myself, so I studied in Taipei, and when I was there, the sheer span in space of China, because you can't be in Taiwan and not constantly be learning and understanding about China because of that very tenuous relationship there. And the kind of shattering that it gave me, it was, well, one, like how immense, the state of China is, how diverse it is, right? And that it really, well, they consider themselves the Middle Kingdom, right? To your point of kind of stamping it in the middle and kind of going out from there, is how much that relationship, like that two-way relationship with the Mercator of, this is the way we accept the world, and now we're going to kind of project out from it. When in reality, it's kind of, it's just a model. It's to a point of ideas or wherever it is. It's just useful until it's not anymore.
Yeah, and like you said, it's very useful if you're a 16th or 17th century navigator, because it shows you the kind of the equal distance on the map, equal distance you've got to kind of cross the ocean. It serves a very specific purpose, and that's why it was developed. So the most dangerous kind of notions in mapping, as in other things are ideas which have been taken up, transferred into another arena where actually they're not very useful or kind of positively deceptive. Now, if they inculcate into you kind of, a false sense of your importance in the world, that may work for a while, but eventually you're going to get a terrible shock. And this is the kind of terrible shock which kind of in North America or kind of in Europe we are getting right now about our kind of our relative position in the kind of economic and political hierarchy in the world, which is not what it was. There's a kind of almost a kind of historical Mercator projection which goes on as well in kind of educational systems, which is now naturally there's a tendency to learn about the history of your own country, kind of at school. I mean, that's entirely natural. However, the kind of what you might term the historical Mercator projection is the assumption which can be given that that's the only history worth knowing about. And worse than that is the assumption that everybody else is learning that same history and knowing about you and appreciating your point of view in exactly the same way. Now, kind of, in Europe, it's easy to kind of, get over this. You speak to somebody from France, you speak from somebody from Spain, you speak from Germany. Now, okay, what do they learn at school? They learn French history, they learn Spanish history, they learn Italian history. Now, you may at school have learned a bit about this and have a kind of appreciation, the kind of historical engagement between Britain and Europe is much more intense over time than, perhaps kind of ultra nationalists here might, kind of care to admit. But you take it further and you say, okay, so how much do I really know about Indian history, and how much do I really know about Chinese history, in depth? Yeah, I mean, okay, so people know that kind of India was kind of part of the British Empire, or most of it was for kind of a couple of centuries, but often that's as far as it goes. And okay, look at kind of primary economic competitor to the United States and to Europe is China. Now, in China, what people learn is Chinese history. So that shapes the way they understand history, the way they look at the world. And if you don't appreciate that, or worse than that, if you don't understand that's where the cultural forces which have shaped how they think about history, then you've got a big problem. If you assume that kind of your average Chinese school child has been brought up on kind of why the how the American Constitution was kind of developed, why that was a great thing, or kind of what the origins of the U.S. Civil War were, and kind of how that shaped kind of later 19th century United States. Then kind of you're utterly mistaken, because they might do, but they know an awful lot of other things. And if you want to understand how they approach the world, you've got to look at it from that way. It's not an easy thing to do. Not every school system, no school system could cope with kind of giving kind of a constant diet of global history, but some of it needs to be there.
Yeah, no, I would love to live in a world where a lot more of it was there. I would love to live in a world where, to be honest, where history was kind of the forefront of the education system. Because I think you can learn about physics and chemistry and all of that with a historical footing. As your point about China, and also to your point about conservatism leading towards radicalism, I think China is a great example with both mapping and history. Because so I've never actually been to mainland China, but my language exchange partner, so I used to meet with this one individual, and I would spend some time speaking Chinese to him, and he would spend some time speaking English to me, and we would kind of go back and forth. And he studied for a semester in China. And the most striking thing that I got from this one particular conversation that's kind of set in stone in my head was him explaining that he saw a map, and the map had had Taiwan as a state of China on it. And he was talking with one of his other fellow classmates at university. And he was saying like how he found that amusing. And he's like, well, what's amusing about it? And he's like, well, Taiwan is not a part of China. And he's like, yes, it is. And, this individual, was going to get his doctorate at the University of Beijing. And he's very, very lauded individual, very knowledgeable. And my friend was having a hard time understanding how somebody who is so knowledgeable could have such a cornerstone or such a piece of it as Taiwan not being part of China as there. And that the reasoning goes back to the conservative, leading towards radicalism, because if they were perhaps to teach ideas about how America became the Constitution and the founding of that. You have to go back to the Enlightenment, and you probably have to get a dash of the Roman Republic in there, and then you have to understand about agrarian systems. And throughout doing all of this, perhaps you're going to have to open up the ideas of your own place in the world, and it kind of challenges the conservatism of whatever it is that this organization is setting itself up to be. And it's interesting how that. I guess I'm going to be looking at this a lot differently, because that conservatism of something is so simple as, no, we're going to color that space red, is actually projects back onto the people and then kind of perpetuates further, where the kind of world that we're musing of living in going forward is one where, instead of saying we're the Middle Kingdom and we're going to kind of go out in concentric circles until we get to the borders, and perhaps once we get past those borders, we're just going to explain the difficulties that we've had between this area and the next area, kind of what that leads to. I think Japan is a great example of that as well.
I mean, in the case of China, it's a fascinating one, because there's one school of thought which might say, okay, China in the past, it fell behind because it didn't need to develop the technologies which it had invented to prosper, because it was already prospering, kind of economically, militarily. There were great kind of natural disasters, floods. But China was able to weather all of those. It had reached a point where it could cope with what it needed to cope with, and it didn't need to do a lot of kind of extra. It didn't need to do too much stuff with the kind of magnetic compass which they invented as well. And and now there's a school of thought which goes, okay, if you kind of confine your way of thinking to one way, if you try to be in forced conformism, then that can make you very successful. There's a power in everybody thinking the same way, because nobody pulls in a different way. But just as kind of dictatorships tend ultimately to collapse, because eventually that dictator will make a catastrophic error, and there is there's just no alternative. That's the way that it's going to be. That a kind of a political kind of intellectual monoculture, no matter how successful it is initially, runs the risk that it's going to come up against a problem that it actually has no plan B to cope with. And there's a possibility that China is replicating its success in the past in a different way, and actually facing the same sort of problem, whereas the apparently kind of chaotic and kind of disordered way in which the West kind of organizes its kind of economy, political thought, with lots of different kind of currents struggling against each other, might even continue to be successful in the future, precisely because actually we might come up against a problem where somebody's got the solution. We're doing 45 different things. Seems to be chaotic, but one of those ways is the way. If China chooses to just do one thing, then just like growing only corn or something, if you get that one beetle that eats it all, then you're done for.
Yeah, that's a great point. I study a lot of tribal North and South American peoples, and one of the ones that when I was coming across, I think it was Inca, and it was like taking an example of an Incan farmer. And it was saying that, they would specialize by crop. So it'd be like, I'm just a potato farmer. But in the way that we think about it from traditional kind of like modern farming is like, oh, that's one potato variety. And so no, that he'd be one potato farmer, but he would grow 200 varieties of potatoes, where, in Ireland during the potato famine, it was mostly one variety. So you get blight in one, and it kind of catches and goes throughout all of them, where, they were much more insulated from that type of thing, which is the exact reason that they did that, which is your point with, the West or I guess traditional West and kind of the liberalism and ideas therein.
Yeah. And, in an odd sort of way, they were trying to be cautious, but they ended up in a way being actually quite radical, having 200 different types of potatoes instead of one. So it seems on the face of it, it's like, hey guys, you could grow a whole lot more potatoes if you just grew one, but it's just like, then eventually something's going to come across and is going to wipe us out, like it happened unfortunately in Ireland.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's truth. I think truth as well as knowledge and wisdom exist a lot in paradox. And I think that's another great example where it's like, you think you're being conservative and growing all of these ones, but you're actually being quite radical. And by doing that, you're actually, saving yourself from a lot of potential suffering down the line.
And you again, throughout kind of human history, you put two apparently kind of opposite things together which shouldn't work together, then actually they don't necessarily cancel each other out. Something kind of new may kind of emerge from that. So I don't know, the kind of actually the tension between kind of liberalism and conservatism in traditional kind of democratic society, they don't necessarily just cancel each other out, but actually they kind of struggle with each other to kind of, one to kind of temporarily get an advantage over the other, produces ways around kind of problems, which if there was only one kind of way forward, would not have emerged. So they're kind of like, the mixed social democratic systems which kind of evolved in Europe after the Second World War, kind of hybrid healthcare systems, which kind of evolved in kind of Europe after the Second World War. Those things would not have evolved without that kind of tension between kind of liberal and socialist views about how things should have been done.
Yeah, and the pendulum kind of keeps swinging today, and I think right now we're in a moment where it's quite tenuous because of, I think once again because of the pace of information and decadence is the word I want to use, right? Is just kind of increasing and becoming more and more widespread. It's a very interesting time because we'll see where it ends up. But I think you're right. I think the course of human history, I'm not one to say that it always moves forward and always progresses, because I think there's too many examples where it doesn't. But I'm very hopeful and have a lot of faith that this is kind of something new is going to come out of this. That's some type of mixed hybrid, something that I can't even conceptualize. It's exciting as it is kind of terrifying at times.
Yeah, I mean, with the political situation that kind of we find ourselves in today, that's it sort of comes out of the a kind of new strategy in which kind of political parties and individual leaders have kind of maybe reverted to or kind of rediscovered, which is actually we could just win completely and permanently and forever. And actually, wouldn't it be great if there was no opposition at all? It was crushed, dissolved, disappeared. And actually, that's a really bad idea. It's a really bad idea on kind of many different levels. One level is, well, if the other side has that idea, they might be the ones which win, in which case our ideas will dissolve, completely. And it's also a really bad idea because, currently with the kind of, the alternation of powers, which was kind of accepted by kind of all mainstream political parties, kind of in modern democratic era, you only lose for a bit. So you've actually got a stake in kind of assisting the other guys once they've won, constructive opposition. So they get some of their agenda in return for the fact that that your day will come. Once that bargain breaks down, then the tension rises. The possibility ultimately of real political violence in a system kind of grows, and the possibility that by trying to win completely, what the end result may be that you will lose completely, which that wasn't in the game before, and it begins to be in the game now. So it's one of these things. Let's not press the big red button because the consequences of this may be not what we may expect.
Yeah, which I often find that I may come across as like I'm going to just use stereotypical tree hugging hippie, but I really think like leading with love, kindness, understanding, compassion, empathy, like this is what's needed, not because of. Like if I want to really look at this like I'm playing a game, right? Like let's be very John Nash about it and lay it out as a board. The best thing if my aim is to reduce suffering and increase stability, it's not to win outright, right? Like that's not the best hand to take. The best hand to take is actually be compassionate, try to understand, have negotiate, and have reason. Because if you do try, like you said, stamp out your competition, what you're going to ultimately lead is either a power vacuum, and it's going to create a hydra of many different conundrums unfolding throughout from that, or you're going to something's going to emerge out of the fact that now there's only one point at the top, and that now we have one thing that we need to knock out, and we can continue to kind of be the only game in town. It leads, if it's an ecosystem that is one species dominated, or anything. It's always having more diversity, more ideas, more competition is going to be safer and more prosperous in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, again, sort of, kind of a defining aspect of human nature is the wish to struggle, but only so much. Not take it to the end. Kind of like step back, kind of live another day. You kind of get. It's not like kind of two lions fighting and kind of one of them wants to kill the other, and that's going to be it. So we kind of part of our ability to imagine is to think, okay. Actually, there's a way I might win in the longer term by accepting losing right now. I can kind of get my place in the hierarchy back again later on if I just survive to live another day.
Right. And I keep going back to Felipe, but a lot of the things you said really stuck with me, and one of them was comfort is the enemy of well-being. And that's kind of we seek comfort, we seek not having to be uncertain about things, right? And accepting a loss or accepting to have to fight another day or something like that. Like that uncertainty is hard to live with. It's not comfortable. But in doing so, it's actually probably better for our well-being, not just in the sense of what you're saying, but also in the sense of what's going to come next and less instability, less turbulence.
Yeah, and put it another way, the confidence in success is the kind of harbinger of failure, really. The moment at which we're sure we've won is the moment we're bound to lose, almost, because it's the moment we take our eye off kind of what even victory means. The moment that we think that using all our resources to build kind of enormous statues which face out to the sea is the moment at which we stop even thinking about the fact that actually we're cutting down all the trees and we're going to have a societal collapse. We are so convinced this is the way and we've got the solution that we can stop thinking about anything else. That's
great. Were you plugging Easter Island there?
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, I was wondering that. That's great. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna think about that a lot as well. The confidence and success. We're always swinging a pendulum of being stuck in a position we can't get out of, getting out of it, and then being overconfident that nothing else can kind of shake us again, I suppose.
Winning, as in the process of winning is great, but having won is the moment you have to start really worrying about what's coming next.
Yeah, which is why you can go to I think athletics is a great. I like athletics a lot because just like history, the truth is almost always stranger than fiction, and two, because it is a game, right? Like it is a set of rules, and if it's basketball, obviously your physical abilities give you, or just stature give you certain advantages, but then how you use that and kind of your mentality within that, it kind of comes out of it. And one of the things you can see if it's the great conquerors or the great athletes of time is they're never happy with their success, right? It's always, I'm just going to go back again. Like that was just a part of it. I got to keep going. I got to keep going. I got to keep improving.
Yeah, I mean, take one of the classic examples of this, which is always cited, is the Roman Empire, which the Roman Republic expanded in a very particular way. It was able to militarize a far greater proportion of its population than anybody else, and so it was able to field armies constantly, which nobody else had almost even thought of doing. That led to too many armies and led to the civil wars, which kind of led to the establishment of the empire. And the way around that was actually to expand even further, kind of more aggressively. And it was the point at which the empire reached its kind of natural geographic bounds, north of Britain, Rhine, Danube, kind of frontiers of Persia in the east. That was the moment really at which they had to sort of begin thinking, okay, now we have to construct a system which will keep this stable. And they didn't do it, very consciously, but that was the challenge that they were faced with, and that begins to be the kind of that's the moment of danger. If you've got the world's most kind of effective and terrifying fighting machine, you're probably going to keep on winning wars, but there's a moment at which the wars have to stop, and then that's the moment you have to think, okay, is the system that I have built adapted to maintain kind of more or less permanent peace, and and it was not, and it faced further challenges from outside, which ultimately it was not able to cope with.
Right, and almost the forces from the outside took advantage of the successes, like the roads to be able to get in so quickly, or the networks and kind of, or even just the increasingly Germanized army that they had. So I wanted to ask you this actually. One of the books that you wrote was going to the frontiers of the former Roman Empire and kind of seeing it in modern day. I just really broadly, how was that experience? Like, how was it like standing there and thinking back on how much has changed in that spot?
It was an absolutely amazing experience. I didn't do it all in one go, but it was something like a total of 7 months. I think 220 days. When I counted it up, and it was, I think, 23 different countries, sort of looking at kind of Roman sites on the front. So it was absolutely astonishing, and it gave a real kind of physicality to the idea of the kind of vastness of the Roman Empire. Actually, kind of going to all of those places. Like right in the south of Algeria, the kind of eastern desert of Egypt, kind of eastern Turkey. Kind of right along the Rhine and the Danube. It was just kind of and to see that kind of Rome had projected its power, kind of and ruled that area with the kind of the kind of the military technology, the kind of the governmental kind of machinery that it had at the time, was still able to keep that as some kind of coherent whole. Was it made one understand what an absolutely astonishing achievement that it really was.
Yeah, I can see that. I think a lot about I think Caesar's conquest of Gaul and the kind of Celtic Holocaust and all of that kind of came from that is really interesting because, well, obviously it's a political writing that he did, but a couple of things that stood out to me when I've read it is his description of the toga wearing Gauls, and how there was like there's this part of the Gallic tribe that was starting to become Romanized, right? So they drank a lot more wine. They started wearing togas, like I was insinuating, and then you kind of go to the frontier past them, and now all of a sudden they're wearing more plaid. They're very wild in a sense. And what it kind of put into perspective to me was, well, if you go to the Roman Empire, because there's a huge shift once it becomes a Christian empire, and Byzantium and all that, is how they were. I don't know if accepting is the right word, tolerating of whatever it is that you wanted to do in your kind of cultural practices, so long as you accept the kind of general state that's an apparatus that's above you. But from that, this multicultural set of peoples and frontiers and the kind of the friction therein, and and Caesar going over the Rhine just to kind of like dip into the Gallic land, and just, or not, that would be Germanic land, and just kind of the awness of it, and his general fear of what that was. And what it did, what always puts in perspective to me is this one ancient peoples that had no way faster than a horse, right? That an individual on a horse, which means you're probably not going to have that much information traveling at any given go, was able to have this multicultural apparatus that stretched from the all areas of the Mediterranean is fascinating. And I'm going to read your book. It's on my queue, because I would love to hear what that was like to be able to kind of traverse it and look back, and especially with your depth of history, and having that all sink in. Because I mean, I pine about the Roman Empire all the time, and partly because I as an American, I feel like I have to know a lot about it, but even as an individual that's in a world that's kind of the result of a lot of European economic ties, it almost all goes back to that, and it's so fascinating. It had to be an incredible experience.
Yeah, I mean, with the traveling at the speed of a horse, something you have to bear in mind is, if the Romans kind of did this leveraging that, it's not one guy on a horse traveling, so it's staging posts. So along the kind of roads, they have this thing called the cursus publicus, which is kind of public post system for the administration. So one dispatch rider would hand the message on to the next. So things actually, they traveled at the maximum speed a horse could go without pause, because it was different. It was different horses. But with with the Gauls and the togas, that piece goes on to say that basically, the Gauls, they took on togas, they took on drinking wine. Basically, without realizing it, they enslaved themselves. They became dependent upon Roman ways and therefore unlikely to, struggle against them. They accepted political servitude, in exchange for this, very comfortable way of life. I mean, the elites in southern Britain, for sure, even before the Roman conquest, had imported Roman luxury goods. They, as elites everywhere, they're kind of a great drinking vessel was the equivalent of a kind of super yacht, kind of at that time. It was, something very desirable. And you bought into the kind of, cultural ideas of society, from which you were buying it. So, that was part of kind of knitting the empire together. It was kind of, it made it worth their while. They wanted to be that. I mean, it was, it's a kind of, it's a bit like the kind of, the export of kind of, American kind of, cultural and economic artifacts that, in a way that kind of, togas were the kind of like blue jeans of the ancient world. They were kind of, they were a symbol, they were a desirable thing, but, they weren't just the item. They carried a kind of, a weight and a kind of implication that you weren't exactly Roman, no more than, kind of, it makes you American wearing a pair of jeans, but, it kind of ties you into a kind of cultural network. And that's what it all did, kind of Roman baths, kind of, Roman roads, kind of, more comfortable towns, peace, kind of an end to the kind of, constant intertribal warfare. Those were all great things. And those were all things which, if you questioned it for a moment, you might think, well, what was this liberty that we had before? This stuff is much more kind of valuable. It means more. It enables us to live a comfortable life. And, and even better than that, the Romans don't insist that the local elites disappear. They don't globally and as a rule impose their own people. Yeah, sure. During the kind of early empire, there's a governor, there's a procurator, there's a very small kind of apparatus, and there's the military for sure. But, they don't come into every kind of small town and say, we're dispossessing you completely. They let the local elites wear togas, become part of the system, and carry on much as they were before.
I'm very happy that you brought it with the blue jeans and the togas, because I was gonna posit that to you, or at least try to lead it down that way, because yes, yes, that's such a great distinction, and that's derives directly to the point of why I think as an American it's important to look back at Rome, because I think intentionally or unintentionally, the founding of America, and I have plans to write a little bit about this, was intentionally drawing from the Roman Republic. And the more that I read about the Roman Republic, the more that I understand why that was actually a really good idea.
They even had a version of the Electoral College, almost, for their elections. I mean, it was actually, it really was a rigged one, because the rich groups had had more votes and they voted first. So the kind of the guys at the bottom in the lower socioeconomic groups actually, although they were there on the parade ground ready to vote, they never really got to vote. So it's the exact analogy of kind of swing states. That actually most of them didn't really matter.
Yeah, there's my friend who was on the first episode, Rowan. We were going back and forth about the Roman Empire once, and I said, one of the things that I find most useful of it is I take any governmental policy and I try to find its analog in the Roman Republic. But the great thing about the Roman Empire, Republic, or either of those epochs, but the great thing is being able to look backwards is, well, one, you got to be cautious of not trying to make too much of a distinction. Just like the map is not the territory, the analog is just a model, right? But you get to see how that kind of plays out over time, right? Like the example I used then, and I'll kind of bring it up again now, is the bread dole, right? The grain dole. Like it starts as this it starts a lot because of it being the victim of its own success, right? Like we conquered all this land, now we have more affluence. Well, we also have all these slaves that we imported, which means farms are no longer, small family lands. They're larger and larger holdings, which means people keep coming into the cities for more economic opportunities, which then kind of leads this economic stratification, and the solution of which is, well, let's give people bread. Which seems one of virtue, which is definitely, Roman ethic. But what it leads to is all these really interesting riots and pushbacks back into the state. And seeing that throughout the course of time is really interesting. But to your point of, Romans saying, we're going to come in, we're not going to I wouldn't say they accepted their culture, but they tolerated it so long as you pay your taxes, give your, allotment of people into the military. And, eventually through that, you'll start wearing togas and all of that, is a very similar analog to globalization now, right? Which is, look at this economic system of finance that you're going to have access to, and then through communication, let's all speak English, and then through all of that, you almost see this unintentional accepting of these systems, even if these systems in some way aren't necessarily benefiting the majority, but only those potentially at the top, right?
And the Romans even complained about their kind of balance of payments crisis, that, there were kind of threats about, the amount of Roman silver which was going east to pay for the silk, which was, ultimately coming from China, and, that kind of Roman kind of, ladies, kind of aristocratic ladies just loved silk dresses. And, they were, apart from this kind of, desire to return to kind of, original Roman morals when nobody would wear such a thing. But, there was the actual worries and, an awareness that it might actually matter. It is a bit kind of mercantilist, kind of, and a bit crude, but kind of, the beginnings of an understanding of kind of, kind of economic flows, and a beginning of the understanding of trade flows and where things came from and what it meant. So kind of, like I say, kind of almost anything that we fret about today, the Romans had begun in some way to worry about and to write about at the time, which was, in a way, why, going back to kind of right at the beginning of our conversation, the rediscovery of Roman manuscripts was kind of, it was kind of revolutionary to kind of think, well, actually, they were kind of thinking about these things. And, to me, something that's kind of quite extraordinary is, the political graffiti, in Pompeii, that survived. That it was preserved entirely by chance because of the volcanic eruption. We would not know really about it. I mean, there were accounts of the violence of elections in very late Republican Rome, but the physical survival of kind of electoral vote Metellus, the other guy is a rogue kind of thing, actually daubed on the walls, kind of makes you think, actually. There were elections, not exactly as we know them, but, there were elections in which somebody really thought they had to canvass and persuade enough people to vote for them. They really happened. And, this, you're talking kind of, in the 60s, 70s BC, this is, kind of by now over 2,000 years ago, is a kind of, it's an extraordinary thought. And, taking it even further back, it's an extraordinary thought that, Athenian democracy obviously is kind of, it's very different from our own. But the process, which, kind of, to be honest, it's something we might consider reintroducing today, of ostracism, kind of in Athenian democracy, by which, as long as 6,000 people at the assembly were present to cast their votes, a politician, anybody, could be exiled from Athens for 10 years, and that was it. They just had to go, no questions asked. And they wrote the names on pots, and they kind of piled them up and then counted them. But the idea that that society could have come up with this safety valve within its democracy when tensions became too unbearable to just get rid of somebody in that way is it's extraordinary that society 2,500 years ago had kind of evolved that strategy and could carry it out without concomitant violence. Can you imagine now? I mean, pick whichever politician you choose, and if the question was, should they be exiled from America for 10 years? It requires 50.1%, and they're gone. Can you imagine, the violence that would erupt? And yet, in ancient Athens, they were able to carry out this procedure, and there was not violence.
Ancient Athens is such a conundrum for me, to be honest. I have such tensions when I think back on it, because okay, so to your points about some of the Pompeii, right? So I love the graffiti at Pompeii. I love a lot of the cultural artifacts because it fills in the gap, right? So I think once again, and I'm just going to say this because I really loathe the American education system, so I'm just going to hate on it a little bit. In the way that history is presented to us, it's presented to us in this is a packaged way, we know everything, go. When the reality is we know nothing. We know breadcrumbs. We don't know what the bread looked like. We don't know what the crust looked like. We don't know what it tasted like. We just know what's left over in scraps, these tiny little fragments. So things like what was the vernacular of Latin on the streets, and how was it spoken? Was it formal, informal? We have no idea, right? Like there's all these little things, or like like you said, graffitis, and what was the way people thought about it. All of that is lost. But in Pompeii, we get a little bit more of kind of that information, and in losing it, we lose a lot of these other dialogues or thought, right? So in Athens, like I would love to know like why that was a useful system. Was it just because the culture was accepting of this as a thing? And part of the reason that I have such tensions with Athens in particular is because if you asked me, like I go through these philosophical questions where I ask myself something for just like to get to the root of an answer, just to kind of challenge my own thinking. And one of them that I'll ask myself is, if there's one individual that I could take all of their writings, and that's all I have on a desert island, and it's the only thing that leads me to whatever to ponder and thought, I almost always come back to Socrates. And it's because I think just some of the thoughts that he had of life and living and all of that, it to me, it almost reads modern, right? Like, like myself, like I love being an athlete. And one of his biggest things is, you have to exercise, because if you don't understand the bounds of your human body, you're not actually going to understand your mental and physical faculties. But yet he was, had to drink hemlock because he was kind of speaking radical ideas, which goes back to conservatism leading to more radicalism. But why I mean, like I said, these are all constructs and models, but, I really want to know what led them to that, right? Like what led them to be accepting of the fact that, they had to at the time accept that he was one of the greatest philosophers or thinkers of their time, but yet they said, you're such a challenge that you have to go away. But yet let his, students in Plato kind of continue to use him in a way, almost mocking the fact that they killed him by using him in his plays. So it's interesting that you brought that up, because the tensions that I have with that, and also the we'll never know, is kind of all summarized right there.
Yeah, I mean, of course, they tried, or at least his friends, kind of in this attachment, they tried not to kill him. So they wanted to make an example of him, but they didn't want to kill him. But he was determined not to play with their game. And, the apology, his kind of speech at the trial, he's basically, it's basically him pleading for the death sentence, more or less. If you're going to find me guilty, just do the whole thing. So that's, whether that's what he said. I mean, it's clearly unlikely he didn't say something like that. Everything that, kind of Plato passes on in the dialogue suggests this is the way that he thought, this is the way that he argued, whether he indeed thought that they would take it to the final degree, but, he left them with no choice. But it's, he was clearly, an extraordinary and, and potentially very destabilizing personality. And, Athens at the time, which kind of one has to kind of understand had gone through, a terrible time, and Athenian democracy with, the defeat in the Peloponnesian War, the temporary suspension of democracy, the kind of establishment of a series of oligarchies, the kind of partial restoration of democracy. So, he was already kind of floating around in a society which had been very, very destabilized. So it was no wonder that, this questioning both perturbed and frustrated, kind of, in equal measure, those who either wanted some level of stability or just to get things back to the way that they had been.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So I want to be conscious of your time, so I think that's a good place for us to kind of pause. Is there anything else you would like to kind of add? And we'll take a moment after the recording, but if there's anything, we got it going.
I don't think so. There's something which occurred to me, and I'm not entirely sure why it occurred to me. It'll come back. Yeah, it was about the vernacular, and we don't know what, how people spoke, and those things which are kind of missing, and those are the kind of intriguing parts of history that two things in North Africa which kind of almost illustrate this, and sort of illustrate both how kind of long-lasting things are and kind of how ephemeral. The long-lasting thing was that there are suggestions that like basically, okay, North Africa is now kind of almost entirely Arabic speaking, and something about the kind of the Roman Empire that it kind of gives you pause for thought is that it was, until the 7th century in the Arab invasions, it was Latin speaking. That, the whole of that area spoke, the governmental level spoke Latin. And there are some indications that as late as the 9th or 10th century, there were Latin-speaking villages in North Africa, that late. There are still Greek-speaking villages, where the dialect in southern Italy is Greek, and that's from the kind of Byzantine occupation. So these cultural fragments, they have kind of immensely long-lasting. But the point about the vernacular that kind of just suddenly occurred to me, that something very interesting that I saw when I went, I can't remember, I think it was in Libya, I think it was at Lectus Magna, and there was an inscription. And in modern kind of Spanish, there's a kind of confusion between P and B. They're kind of, almost the same. But there was an inscription I came across where I think it was something 7, so somebody who died 7 years old, so it was septem. But the stone carver had written it with a B, a very precise B, septem. So clearly, in North Africa there at the time, there was that same confusion between a P and a B, because the local guy, the stone carver, heard somebody probably say, kind of verbally, I want you to say my little kind of Johannes died, age septem. And he said, the person said septem, because that's how you wrote it. And so the stone carver took him and phonetically and literally wrote that. So, sometimes we can actually just get kind of, glimpses into how the accent literally, and, intriguingly, that PB confusion existed then. And, who knows how that was transmitted, maybe via Arabic, kind of into modern Spanish. And that sort of, that kind of almost lisp kind of, made its way across the centuries and kind of, ended up in modern Spanish.
Yeah, what a great example of how history evolves over time and its legacies are still here. And I would argue its importance as well.
Mm-hmm. So that was the one thing which occurred to me. But I think I think we could probably speak for another 3 or 4 hours.
I would be delighted. Yes.
But unfortunately, I think it's probably kind of closing up to wrap up time. I've got a few minutes more.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'll pause it and we can wrap in a second, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on. This was an incredibly fascinating and stimulating conversation.
It's been a pleasure. And, like all great conversations, I wish it could go on and on.
Myself as well. Well, thank you very much.